So with the structure question, what you'd need to do is obviously have a look, and it will always tell you where the source is taken from. So in this case, it says that the source is taken from the opening of the novel. I'm just going to make that a little bit clearer for people. There we go. So what you'll need to do is start thinking to yourself, well, what does an author tend to do at the opening of a novel? And obviously this could be taken from the middle of the novel or the end of the novel. So it's really important to think about what it is that you would expect to see. So if we just move that aside for a second, we could have a reminder of a general sort of narrative structure sort of pattern, if you like. So usually with an opening novel, you have the exposition, which is the beginning of a novel, and that would then rise with some rising action there, like a problem perhaps that the main character has to face, and that rises then to the climax, which is the most exciting part, the bit that you're most tense. Okay, and then we've got some anticlimax there just before we reach the end of the novel, the denouement. There we go. Okay, and that then would be the resolution where all the loose ends are tied together. So when you do have a structure question, do have a look about where in the novel the source is taken from, because it will make a difference to what you would expect to see. So in the exposition, of course, we would expect to see a description of setting, maybe some weather there to set an atmosphere, the pathetic fallacy. Maybe we would also expect to see some description of character or characters, some sort of introduction to place them in that setting. And really the exposition is used to establish the mood or the atmosphere or the tone of the piece, to give us some expectation of what to see when we see the rise in action and how that builds up to its climax. Z for Zachariah, which is the text that we are answering about today, is quite unusual. I expect that you have read this. If you haven't, make sure that you do before you carry on with this video. Just twist that round there so you can see it. As you can see, there we go, it actually starts with the words, I am afraid, someone is coming. It's almost as if we are in the centre of that action with the narrator already. We haven't had any time really to get to know the narrator, get to see where he or she is placed within the setting. That's the first thing that we are introduced to, is this diary entry, and then we have those two very short sentences there, almost as if we are kind of with her or with him. It's actually her. By the time you finish reading, you'll understand that. And we see, there we go, we see that this person is already feeling quite a lot of tension. And because it is done through the narrative perspective of I, we also begin to empathise as if we are placing ourselves in that situation. So how do I go about answering a question on that then? I assume that I would have read the source and I've already answered some questions on language, so already I would have got to know that source pretty well. Just trying to twist this around so everybody can see. There we go. So I would actually begin by thinking about how I would normally expect an exposition to look. I think this question is largely about where things are positioned, and you need to think about that and explain that in your answer. So I'm going to very quite quickly really just have a look at my question and just break it down. I cannot talk about language in this question. If I do, even if I do a fantastic answer, there'd be no way I'd actually pick up any marks. So what is it when we're talking about structure? I've just highlighted my question there, and you can do the same. Structure then, we are talking about the positioning of things, positioning of information, positioning of sentence types. We might be talking about what it's made up of. So we might be talking about the narrative perspective. We might be talking about where things are placed to create a particular meaning. So if we did have, for instance, the weather there described, and it was significant, if it did particularly add to the atmosphere of the piece, we could talk about that. So that would obviously be your pathetic fallacy. But we're looking really about where our focus lies. So are we looking from above first and then zooming in? So we might have an element of zoom. We may have start with the zoom, as we do here, and then move outwards again to have a look at the whole, to place the narrator within a context. We may have some element of flashback, particularly if we have started, as this text does, with "I am afraid someone is coming." We need, as a reader, to know why that person is afraid. We need to know where they are and what might happen. And so this author has decided to zoom in straight away at the beginning, and then by the end of that extract, we have a much greater picture of what has happened before it. So flashback in this case is rather important structural feature. The other thing you could talk about is sentence forms. Use sentence forms very carefully. Sometimes it can be difficult to write about sentences and say anything about interesting in them. However, in this case, I think we could talk about sentences. We're not talking about the words within those sentences. We're not talking about those sentences from a language perspective. What we're talking about is the position of sentences, why that sentence type and why is that there. And that's what I'd really like to open with, because this source does open with quite particular sentence types. So I could talk about those two short sentences, and I could say, right, the writer opens the novel in quite an unusual way to what I expect, and that's obviously an interesting feature. So that again is what interests me. So I'm going back to that all the time. Having a little bit of problem just making that clear. Okay, I think that should be doing it. So I could say the writer opens the novel in an unusual way. I'm going to use my semicolon. That's going to introduce why I find it unusual. I could have used the word because, but time in an exam is of the essence, so any shortcuts would be welcome. So opens the writer in an unusual way, and I'm going to talk about this idea of exposition, about what we'd normally expect to find, and yet this author jumps straight into the action. So I could say normally a writer introduces the setting or character in the exposition. And if you couldn't remember that posh word exposition in the exam, all you'd have to do is say in the beginning. But here, the action seems to already build to a climax. We're already feeling a great tension, and if we have a quick look at our original little drawing there of the narrative structure, we can see that, I mean, here, we'd already be sort of here, really, wouldn't we? So the only way for this author now to get out of that, obviously they can't end the novel, sending the opening, they would then have to go back and do some flashback and then return again to this sort of area. And that's how it's structured. That's why it's quite an interesting way to open this particular piece. Let's get that there so you can see. So now I could almost talk about the positioning of those sentences, couldn't I? Because that's really adds some of the tension in. So I could say like the positioning, and I think this is a good phrase to use if you are going to talk about sentences. if you open up with the words the positioning of, you know straight away you're focused on structure